afternoon, everyone. It's so great to look through the list of attendees and to see so many familiar names, and just know that we have people that are engaged and interested and excited to talk about housing during the middle of the holiday season. I was just looking to think, what is it, 12 days till Christmas, and there's just so much going on. So thank you for your time. My name is Ryan Vincent. I'm Executive Director at Kansas Housing Resources Corporation, or KHRC. I'm on my 17th year now at KHRC, and I was thinking about, that forever our organization has known that home is so important, whether it's jobs, for healthcare, for education, for vibrant neighborhoods and communities. And certainly we all know, especially during the holidays, that a happy home is absolutely necessary for happy families. Historically, our office has been quietly behind the scenes administering programs, and yet we've always stepped up to the plate, whether it's been a tornado in Greensburg or Southeast Kansas flooding, the Great Recession, when the market collapsed, or today's pandemic. But I'm truly excited right now to be talking about not a crisis, but our underlying housing problem, and more importantly, our plan on how to make it better. We've been tackling the underlying problem, but never with enough resources, despite wonderful intentions from great community partners like you. But the stars have aligned on multiple levels. We have a once in a generation investment from the federal government right now with the ARPA resources, the possible infrastructure resources. We have a pandemic that has focused our attention on the importance of housing stability. Whether that's the policymakers or the media's attention, these conversations are happening in your communities, and there's so much of importance at this very minute. So a year ago, we decided, in partnership with the Department of Commerce and the Office of Rural Prosperity, that our first step in addressing this underlying housing problem was to take a snapshot. It was to take a picture of what our needs are in our state, to find out what's not working, to find out what's working, to help us allocate our respective resources better, but even more importantly, to start a dialogue about what the gaps are and what we can do to fill those gaps to make sure that we're meeting the needs of Kansans to unlock home. Amy and Charlie, who you'll be hearing from shortly at RDG, have been key partners to make this happen. This last year, along with our great steering committee members and our friends, including Tricia and Josh, and a number from the Office of Governor and Office of Rural Prosperity, have all been on this journey together. We've had 2 statewide tours. We've had 70 plus stakeholder meetings. We've had thousands of surveys, great conversations in every neck of the woods. I want to make sure I do a shout out before I turn over to Charlie and Amy, to not only ORP and the Department of Commerce, but their leadership. Lieutenant Governor Toland has been key in keeping this moving forward. A big shout out to former Lieutenant Governor and now State Treasurer Lynn Rogers, who was key to getting this venture going. We had great steering committee members from all over the state, every different region, every different stakeholder group you can imagine. A big shout out to my team at KHRC, who are essential to this effort, from Alyssa and Barry and Emily and everyone who's been behind the scenes, as well as our great board members. But at this point, I'm pleased to turn it over to Amy and Charlie to share about the work they've done this last year, the journey we've been on, and more importantly, the journey that we're on together going forward. Amy, Charlie.
Great. Thank you so much, Ryan. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to see the numbers of attendees here with us today, and who we got to meet with over the last 2 weeks as we toured around the state of Kansas and shared what we're going to be sharing here with you today. I also, Ryan gave a shout out to all of those folks, and I would like to double that in a year when they had unprecedented ARP funding and were working their way through that funding and the resources that they had, at the same time taking on the development of this plan and really giving it the time and attention that it really did truly deserve. So we appreciate all the help they've provided in a year in which their plates were already very full. So thank you so much for that. We're going to jump right in then we want to talk a little bit about, and Charlie, if you want to go ahead and share your screen, we're going to share a little bit about the process we went through, give you a high-level overview of the state profile, the housing profile that we've developed. And then from that, we're going to go into a little bit of what has been identified as our overarching housing goals and some of the strategies for moving those goals forward. Over the last year, so starting in January, we kicked off with the team at KHRC and Office of Rural Prosperity and quickly formed a great steering committee that had representatives from all across the state. They met with us on a monthly basis, were engaged, gave us great feedback and guidance as we moved through this process. Starting in the spring, March, April, May, and actually even into June, we held, as Ryan said, over to 71 listening sessions in which we had interactions with over 425 individuals. And we also were holding an online survey in which we had about 4,400 respondents. And Charlie's going to talk a little bit more about what we learned from those pieces and from the statewide profile, which helped us then build those two pieces coming together to build what do we see as our key issues and opportunities for our goals, and how do we begin to move forward with regards to some of those goals. So I'm going to hand it over to Charlie, and I'm going to let him talk a little bit about the profile and what we learned from the community engagement.
Thank you, Amy. As Amy mentioned, we've got a lot of input throughout this process across the state. In fact, we just wrapped up kind of a road tour the past 2 weeks, touring around different regions in Kansas, presenting this presentation across the state. And there's many things we heard even during this most recent road tour across the state that we've worked to also incorporate into the assessment. So a few items just kind of as we go through the series of slides here today of note. We obviously, for the sake of time, could not go over every single data point that we've looked at in the study, and you'll see in the study, but try to focus on some of the highlights that are going to inform some of the strategies and goals that Amy is going to be talking about here later in the presentation. So just note each slide, there is several probably other data points that we've looked at in the study. Another note in this is even on this first slide here, looking at population change. We started this process in January of this year in 2021, expecting that we would be receiving some 2020 census data in April, actually originally, and then it got pushed to September. And then what we received in September, as many of you might be aware, was kind of half of what we would expect. So things like age cohort breakdowns were not given out. And so we've used 2020 census data where we could. And then other data sources, we use 2019 American Community Survey, as well as other sources like Bureau of Labor Statistics and so on. So just kind of a disclaimer there when you start to see some of the information in this slide. But we'll kick it off. One of the obviously major data points when looking at housing is population growth over time. And this is probably not new information to many of you on this call. You've probably all seen your 2020 census counts. And here the major trends is really a continuation of what we're seeing in other Midwestern states, as well as population is converging towards our metropolitan counties. Amy might have mentioned we've divided the state into 9 regions within the assessment to look at regional strategies and challenges as well. And we found that even within those 9 regions, when we looked at rural counties, micropolitan counties, and metropolitan counties, even those differences among those counties were interesting to look at. In fact, when we looked at what we call micropolitan county or mid-sized cities like Salina or McPherson or cities around that size, we were finding that population was growing in some of those areas but not all of them. So this was something interesting that was really regional specific when we started diving into the population related data. I mentioned that age cohort data was not available with the 2020 data that was released in September. So we did rely on 2019 data for that. But Nonetheless, the data is showing Kansans are aging, again, similar to other states in the Midwest. The 65 to 74-year-old age cohort grew the fastest since 2010. This map here is showing kind of median age across the counties in Kansas. The darker hues, blue colors, represent an older median age. And you can see that loosely correlated with our more rural areas tend to be older, where our more metro areas tend to be younger, especially obviously our areas with major universities and colleges. This really tied closely to what we were hearing in our listening sessions and our discussions with folks. We did hear quite often in many sessions the need for accessible, universal design type options for folks to age in place or age within their communities where they've spent maybe their whole lives and would like to continue living within those communities. Regarding income, we heard a lot, obviously, with the pandemic and where we're at with situations and with inflation and those sorts of items about income and affordability of housing, and something we looked at deeply in the assessment. When we looked at income change from 2010 to 2019, we did find incomes are increasing, but not always at pace with inflation everywhere. We have been having to put a disclaimer on this slide as well, because our median household income data was available from the census for 2019. We have adjusted for inflation through 2019. So this does not include what headlines you might have been seeing over the past year about the rising inflation in 2020 and 2021. That is something we've noted, but this, when we looked at comparing the data over time, we did have to benchmark to 2019 items. So again, though, income growth was not equally distributed across the state or between owners and renters. We tended to see incomes of owner-occupied households increasing more often than renter-occupied households. Another item that probably came up in every single listening session of the 71 we held was related to the condition of the housing stock and the age of the housing stock. We were very fortunate to be able to get some good data from the Kansas Department of Revenue Property Valuation Division regarding housing condition ratings that the assessors put on houses, and also age we took from the census and also some local sources as well. But we find that the housing stock across Kansas is typically older than 1960. In fact, in the map on the upper map here, the lighter colors or the whiter colors represent an older housing stock. And you can see the north central part of Kansas has some of the oldest housing stock in the state. And we heard that a lot in our listening sessions about maintaining what we have, maintaining our existing stock, whether it's through rehab, even some of our most dilapidated homes, making them either livable again or demolishing them for new units. And we did find when we compared housing condition to housing age that there is a correlation with more homes being rated in poor condition the older they are, or the older the median year built is in the county. So this is a strategy and an item Amy will talk about in more detail when we get into the strategy piece. One item when we started to dive into the affordability aspect of housing, we tend to look at and started to look at in a lot more detail was median home values in a county versus the median income in a county. And this is just one of many metrics that the study dives into, but this one kind of gives us a baseline understanding of whether a market in a county, housing market in a county is undervalued or perhaps unaffordable for folks living in that county. And what we found relative to incomes is housing values are depressed in many rural areas. You can see on this map, a lot of the lighter colors, the whiter hues represent what we would call an undervalued market. And really what that means is the example we've used in the road tour and continue to use is in many of these areas, and we heard this in our listening sessions, the cost for a builder to build a home, what it would cost to do that versus what the home would actually appraise for. There's a large gap there. The cost is much more than the appraised value of that home. And this creates some challenges for building. Obviously, it's becomes a higher risk for the builder. There could be financing challenges as well as many other things. And we've heard that in a lot of our rural areas. We also heard it in some of our metro areas, however, as well, including our inner kind of core older neighborhoods of some of our metro cities. And this was something we'll dive into in the strategies as well, but was prevalent in many of our conversations. Some of the more traditional look at affordability is what HUD would define as cost burdenness. So this is defined as having to pay 30% or more of your income on housing, whether that's ownership or renter housing. And what we found is Kansas renters are more cost burdened than owners since 2010. We found the number of renter households that are cost burden increased more than owner. And again, this was reiterated in our conversations that we spoke with folks about. This could either be attributed to just renter incomes not increasing as much, rents rising because of low supply. And then when not just thinking about home ownership, but the other costs associated with housing and daily necessities such as transportation and childcare, all of these things start to add up, and more so for renters. Another kind of data point, and this graph really doesn't do justice by itself. There's several other data points underneath here that you'll find in the study, but one thing we heard in every single listening session as well is the competition for units within a community, not just the extreme low inventory of the recent year since the pandemic kind of kickstarted the competition for existing homes, but really over time. We heard employers having many years of struggling to find employees because there's no homes available. They may have an applicant who's interested, who applies, but comes to the community to find a home and they can't find it. So they end up declining the offer and moving elsewhere. And when we looked at the data, we found that many households are indeed competing for similarly priced units. So there's gaps across the board. And there are affordable units on the market, but there are existing units that are already filled by other people who are already living in those units. So there's really a prevention of movement in the housing market. And the example we've been using is maybe a couple moves to a community. They're there for a few years. They start a family, they're growing, and they desire to move into maybe a 3 or 4 bedroom home to expand. That option's not available, so they end up staying in maybe their 1 or 2 bedroom home longer than they would desire to or like to. Where if the other option was available, maybe they would move and then open up that perhaps more affordable unit for another young couple, or maybe a retiree or empty nester looking to downsize or something similar. So that's just one example, but there's many examples of this movement in the housing market being somewhat stagnant over the past several years. Oh, there we go. So those were just, again, kind of teasing you with several data points to inform some of the strategies that Amy will be talking about, but expect when you see the study, several other data points kind of building on those items as well. We did want to talk in more detail today about our public kind of input that we've gained throughout the process. I know Amy mentioned this, but in the spring, we did conduct a listening session tour across the state. I think many people that I saw registered for this webinar that had attended those, as well as our virtual sessions in the spring as well. And then our survey, Amy mentioned 4,400 survey responses broken down, as you can see here. For those that did take the survey, you may have recalled the introduction to that survey asked if you were a builder or developer, a real estate professional, a housing service provider, or city or staff official. And then if you answered yes to that, you got filtered actually to a more detailed survey that then asked your expertise in those relative fields. So that's why you see 2,600 community member survey respondents here. Those would have been the folks that didn't answer yes to any of those other categories. So there are many, obviously many data points from the survey, and you'll see those full responses in the assessment. Here's just kind of some of the major survey highlights that we found and that really reiterated across our conversations throughout the state. Housing price and quality rose to the top. I mentioned that in the data points regarding housing condition, the desire to maintain homes in good condition, whether that's help from the income side to be able to afford to do that, or from the actual ability side if you're an older household who just has trouble maintaining and keeping up with home maintenance. About 62% of respondents did feel that public funds were needed to remove dilapidated housing. So again, moving into the very poor condition homes and that maybe are beyond repair. There is across the state, there seems to be good agreement that public funds could be used for that. Opportunities for seniors, again, mentioning accessible universal design for the aging population. And then we shouldn't forget about improving quality of life. We did ask some questions in the survey regarding if folks were looking to move in the next 3 years, whether that's to a new housing option or whatever that might be. About 59% of survey respondents said they were looking to a new place to live in the next 3 years. And the highest reason was to a different community for quality of life reasons. So that tells us we need to provide housing units, but we also need to make sure that we're providing communities that people want to live in. Not just employment opportunities, but things like trails, parks, neighborhoods, connections, all of those things are still important when we think about our housing strategies moving forward, which Amy will jump into. So with that, I want to turn it over to Amy to dive into some of those goals and strategies that you'll see in the study and the assessment. Want to make sure we have enough time for questions and answers, because I know this is probably what a lot of people have jumped on here to hear about. So I'll turn it over to Amy, and then we'll get into our question and answer time here and try to address as many as we can.
Great, thanks, Charlie. So as Charlie mentioned, and I shared earlier, we begin then to build up the goals around what we learned from both the statewide and regional profiles and our community input, our listening sessions and survey pieces. Before I dive into this part though, I want to share a couple of things to kind of set the stage, I guess you could say. And one of them is that when we started this process, was especially excited that we were being asked to do a statewide housing study. We weren't necessarily being asked to do an affordable housing study because often we think about affordable housing and the need for that, but that does not live in a bubble outside of the rest of the housing market. So we were being challenged to really look at the full big picture of what's happening in the overall housing market and what are the hurdles and opportunities for generating more housing, meeting our needs that we have across the entire state. The other piece of this that I would like to say is that through our listening sessions, even the last 2 weeks, we heard lots of great comments and feedback and some very detailed things, kind of very in the weeds, I guess you could say, ideas and comments. And what we realized was that, and we talked with our committee about this, is that we really had to find ways that we could take this plan to be targeted. The way I've also often described it is, where could it have tendrils that might be going out that would help us address some of these maybe very specific needs that would maybe generate almost like the snowball, right, going down the hill, picking up the momentum to address these other the other needs and issues that we have. There was also some things that were maybe very technical that KHRC and Office of Rural Prosperity made notes on and said, okay, those are things that maybe it doesn't belong in the plan, but we're definitely following up on them. So I share that because I just want everybody to realize that we did take note of all of those things. And there's a lot of those things that will be also happening kind of in the background and outside of this study specifically that are maybe more immediate things to also address. So jumping right into some of the goals, one of the things that you saw from the charts that Charlie shared was that the bar chart where we had lines going down and some lines going up. And he talked a little bit about this. One of the things that we saw and heard, and we can see also from the age of our housing stock, is we actually have a number of units that are affordable to our middle income range households. But as we went out into the communities and talked with individuals, they were telling us there's just nothing available. Well, you can quickly realize that part of our issue is that those homes, they exist, but they're filled. Somebody's living in them and they don't have other options for moving around. So one of the key goals as we move forward is how do we free up more middle income housing, and how do we add to that overall stock that we have within each of the communities? Go ahead, Charlie. Diversifying the state's house, this is tied closely to that first goal of how do we free up or add more, and that ties to diversifying our housing stock more so that we can match our local demographics and match our employee needs. Charlie used the story of a young family wanting to maybe expand to a 3 or 4 bedroom home. The other analogy that I like to use a lot of times is the empty nester retires. They've left a job opening for a new young family or a new individual to move to your community to fill that job, but they haven't at the same time freed up their home. They haven't left their home, often because, again, they're not seeing the option in which they want to move to. So having that variety in the market being really important. Go ahead, Charlie. One of the key things we also heard was the need to extend our housing security that we have. So I like to put this into kind of 2 buckets. The first one of this is it is going to get very specific. So we have programs out there today that specifically are focused on the construction and of affordable units. So units that are affordable to households making 80% or 60% of our area median income. What we have seen over the past few years is a number of those units leaving these programs. So they are only usually required to be in the programs for 15 to 30 years. And there's a number of them that are requesting after the 15-year period to potentially leave earlier. In fact, it's almost over 4,000 that we've seen leaving the programs since 2017. At the same time, we have not seen that many units coming into these programs. So we need to be finding ways to preserve our existing units and reinvesting in the older units to ensure that we have kind of a continued stock of affordable housing. The other piece of this that I like to think of when we talk about extending housing security is how do we help households build wealth, I guess is the best way that I've described it, so that they can stay in a unit, take that job in which they're going to get paid a little bit more, take that dollar raise and earn a little bit more so that they can build more stability within their household to potentially take on to purchase something or to go to a rental unit that is a little bigger or market rate unit that's more appropriate of or has the amenities that they're looking for. So how do we continue to build that housing security, which I will give a shout out to Kansas and the folks in Kansas with the moderate income housing program. It actually allows to do that. And we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a minute. We need to continue to invest in our older housing stock, including identifying what has been happening with our vacant units. And I'll get into that a little bit more, but our older housing stock is our best source of affordable housing. So we need to make sure we're continuing to invest in that and preserve those units for the next generation. We also need to address our building trades labor shortage. So this was actually kind of an interesting piece for us. Again, this was an item I think we heard in about every one of our listening sessions that we held, and that is that lack of carpenters, plumbers, electricians, general contractors, just that labor shortage that we have across the entire state. This is not an issue that is unique to our rural areas. We heard the same thing within our urban areas of this labor shortage occurring. So it was interesting. We actually came to our committee with this one and said, you know, this kind of gets out of the realm of what you might traditionally think of being in a housing study, but we think it's pretty important. And they agreed and said, we really, if we don't have somebody to swing a hammer or to install the plumbing, we're not going to be able to address our housing needs that we have across the state. Finally was extending our existing human capital. We have a lot of great resources in the state of Kansas. We've got a lot of really knowledgeable individuals, but we also have individuals and communities out there that are saying, we're not really sure where to start. We really could use some assistance. So one of our key goals is, how do we extend that human capital around the state, share that knowledge, and build the next generation of individuals who are passionate and excited about implementing housing initiatives and housing programs. So as we move forward and begin to think about how do we begin to implement these goals, we want to start off with middle income housing. And for all of these strategies, we tried to break them down into state level things that could be happening and local level. So hopefully communities can look at this plan and find things that might be appropriate for them, or that they could pull out and initiate in their communities. So starting with the middle income housing, and this was around our goal of how do we add or free up more of those middle income units. We need to start with greater funding of the moderate income housing program. So this program is funded at about $2 million a year and receives probably about triple that in requests on an annual basis. It is also a program that's specifically targeted to just communities of under 60,000. So one of the things that we said is, this program needs to be funded at a higher level. The need is there. It's a very popular program. It's, having worked in multiple states, this is a great program. The flexibility that it provides, the ease of use. So we're just saying that it probably just needs to be funded at a greater level. The other piece to this is that we heard from many urban areas is the need for this product too, that they needed more moderate income housing also, that what they were seeing, although they have a lot of construction activity happening, it often felt like it was happening at higher market rate points. So we said that there's probably a need to develop kind of a parallel program that addresses this moderate income workforce housing need that we have in some of our rural area or in some of our urban areas. We also said, let's take a look at how we can begin to engage our employers more, and starting with looking at our state business incentives. So we have a number of great incentives in the state of Kansas, and we think there's an opportunity to expand those to include housing. So for example, we have incentives that allow for a tax break for investment in certain investments, including, say, expanding your facility or buying additional equipment and so forth, that you can get a tax break for that. And we said, why don't we include housing? So if a business invests within housing in their community, that they can receive a tax break for that, as they would for other investments that they would make within their business. There's programs out there like rent-to-own programs, which usually use low-income housing tax credits. And under these programs, it's a way that, one, we bring more moderate income housing to the market, and two, we help families to build, or households to build some of that wealth, build equity. So in these programs, a household pays rent on the unit, and a portion of their rent goes into an escrow account that they can then take to either purchase that home at the end of the life of that program, or they can take their money that they've saved up and use it as a down payment on another home within the community. So it kind of has a two-part mechanism to it. At the local level, when we talk about strategies, you're going to hear us talk about some things that are already in existence today that Kansas communities are doing. And we just wanted to reinforce some of those, talk a little maybe about tweaks that we could be thinking about. So the first one of these under the local level are bond programs, and programs are not something we are seeing in Kansas right now, but we've definitely seen it in other cities across the United States, from large metropolitan areas to small communities of just say 15,000. And what they are is they're usually maybe voter initiated bonds in which the community decides what is their specific housing need. Do we need to be building more infrastructure and lot development? Do we need assistance with rehab programs or down payment assistance? So the idea of picking the path for the community and then saying we're going to charge forward on that. At the local level, thinking about our RHIDs and upper story RHIDs, how are we using those? Making sure the education to other communities is getting out there for the use of those programs. On the RHIDs, we have several communities that are well experienced and well versed in those programs. And so we're saying, you've kind of aged into these now. Now is this an opportunity to not only just think about the price points of units that are going into when doing RHIDs, but also the diversity of housing. So we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a second. The last one on there is industrial revenue bonds. This is something, again, we've seen a number of communities around Kansas using, and specifically for multifamily rental units and rental developments, mixed use developments in which those IRBs can be used. Go ahead, Charlie. The next piece is low income housing, so that we still do have a need for good quality, lower income housing. I talked a little bit about the low income housing tax credit projects and the fact that we're seeing thousands of the units leaving those programs. So we need to develop some funding to fill some gaps. So I'm going to go into the weeds a little bit more here. So what we've seen since 2017 is that the actual credits themselves aren't worth as much as they were before some of the tax law changes that occurred in 2016, 2017. Which means that now that the credit doesn't create enough financing, that there's still a gap, and a growing gap now that we see maybe with some of the inflation. So we need to be thinking about ways we need to fill that gap, whether that's through a state tax credit, whether it's through other sorts of gap financing that we can think about to fill that gap and to encourage more of those projects to be done. We need to continue to inject funds into our very low income projects and funding sources that are essential out there. And then how do we start to wrap around the services that we need often for our at-risk populations? At the local level, that gap financing for low-income housing tax projects can also be pretty important, because we can be thinking about using things like the RHIDs, like TIF, other gap financing. Maybe it's our employers, whatever it might be, to help us fill that gap and encourage more of those programs. We also heard a lot of concern about the ability to use choice housing vouchers or Section 8 vouchers. And what happens on these is that a landlord actually has to be pre-qualified. They actually have to go through an inspection process. And that's often kind of a discouraging point, especially if you have a very robust housing market. There's really not much incentive for a landlord to go through that program. So we've said maybe one of the things that we need to do is set up some incentives for landlords to go through that program, and then also maybe some insurance to make sure that they're against any property damages or any other concerns that they might have. And finally, coordinating services. We got a lot of great services around the state, making sure that those are all coordinated and working together in a holistic fashion. Go ahead, Charlie. The conservation of our older housing stock. At the state level, we think there's an interesting program out there. It's actually being proposed at the national level, and it's called the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act. Charlie talked a little bit about that gap between that we see in rural areas and in inner city, kind of older urban neighborhoods too. That gap between what it costs us to build or to remodel and what they may get appraised at. And so the idea behind this act was that there would be a tax credit specifically for filling that gap between the cost and the final appraisal. And we said that, we didn't see any reason why it's being proposed at the national level, but we really didn't see any reason why this also couldn't be a state level tax credit that could help in those rural areas and our urban areas to fill that gap. We had lots of conversations around the neighborhood revitalization program, which is an existing program. And what we learned was that the program is really good in some ways, and then it kind of misses the target in one other aspect. So it works really effectively when we're thinking about kind of reinvestment. So if you're not familiar with this program, it is a tax rebate from reinvesting in an area. So if a developer is looking at doing a multifamily or a duplex rental properties, the rebate can be appealing to them. They're going to potentially hold on to that property and that rebate coming back to them. On the other hand, it is not necessarily that appealing to a lower income household. So a lot of these neighborhood revitalization programs are targeted to our older, lower income neighborhoods. And what we found was that a low income household is maybe one, and we're going to talk a little bit about this more later, but is going to struggle, one, to come up with the funding to do the rehab. And then they have to come up with the taxes, to pay the taxes to have them rebated back to them. So it's just not an appealing program necessarily to them. So, but it is also, it is effective. It is not always necessarily easy to initially get set up. So what we kind of heard was, why don't we leave the program the way it is and doing what it's needing to do, but let's create a second program specifically targeted to our homeowners, our lower income household homeowners. That's maybe more of an abatement type program that would make it appealing to them, because often we did also hear, boy, I don't know if I want to make some big improvement because my property taxes are going to take a big jump. So a way to graduate those property tax increases over time. Energy efficiency assistance. We had lots of really great conversations around that, and that concern about, even if I can find an affordable unit, it might be an older unit, which means that it's often less energy efficient. So how do we make sure that we don't have a $400 a month utility bill in February and taking away a lot of that affordability? So we need to inject some more funding into those programs. We need to make sure that our local utility providers are incentivized and encouraged to work with homeowners on making those energy efficiency improvements also. At the local level, there's great programs out there, and we see some of this even in Kansas, acquisition, rehab, resale. And the reason we look at these at a local level is because they do take a good local eye to make sure they're being administered, and the coordinating with contractors and making sure the work's getting done and all of those things. So often these programs are done by a local nonprofit, and they purchase the home, do some minor rehabs, and sell it to qualifying homes. So it's a way to not only preserve existing affordable housing, but then to kind of preserve that affordability, because the nonprofit's not looking, to make a 200% return on their flip that they're doing. Local rehab programs, injecting additional funding into those, whether that is at the local level, which communities can do, but also thinking about it at maybe more of a statewide level too. Historically, in rural areas, rehab programs were funded through home or CBDG, which are federal funds. Those funds have been cut dramatically over the last decade. And so that funding has not trickled down to the local level. I also want to point out that rehab programs aren't always necessarily the easiest things to administer. So whenever especially if we're using federal dollars like home and CBDG, so whenever possible, if we can come up with ways to find local funding to do those, it does provide a little bit more flexibility. We'll talk about that a little bit more here in a minute. Finally, the vacancy rate in rural areas, we were seeing communities and counties with very high vacancy rates at the same time that we were being told they didn't have any units available. Somebody would move to the community and there wasn't any place to buy or to rent, but yet we have a really large number of vacant units. The reasoning for that vacancy number really does vary from community to community. So one of the things we said is that each community really needs to step back and kind of take a deep dive look at what is causing their vacancy rate. Is it dilapidated units? Is it we just have a number of units where mom or dad have passed away and the title is a mess, or the family is just overwhelmed by cleaning out the home and getting it on the market? Whatever it might be, figuring out what's driving that vacant number, and then identifying your appropriate local strategies for addressing those. The next one is diversifying our housing. At the state level, it can be really simple that we just need to begin to look at our program guidelines and preferences. So the existing programs that we have, do they score higher if they are proposing a product type that is helping diversify that local market or that particular community? Creating a housing toolkit that helps communities understand, what does diverse housing stock look like? What does it take to get those units on the market or bring them to the market? On the local level, development agreements. What do our development agreements look like? Are we encouraging more diverse products within those agreements? Streamlining our approval process. So this kind of goes to an overall look within the zoning ordinance. So maybe in our more urban areas, we heard concerns about, we'll propose a different product type, often maybe a little bit more denser than what that community has seen. And a lot of neighbors will come out in opposition, but it really does match with what the community said they wanted to have within their comprehensive plan. So how do we make that process more streamlined and allow them to get those products to the market faster without incurring excessive costs of redesign and so forth that are then passed on to the home buyer or the renter. At the local level, it's taking a good look at your zoning ordinances. Do you have things in there, parking requirements, lot size requirements that just make it really hard to do different product types that would help diversify your market? Finally, packaging site plans, putting things together that can tell a developer or builder that says, if you follow this, it'll be an administrative approval process, and we can move along that process a little bit faster. Go ahead, Charlie. Next up is building our human capital. One of the things we heard again was the need for communities who were very interested in trying new things. We want to do an RHID, but we've never done one before. We'd like to set up a land bank, but we don't even know where to start. So one of the things that we thought might be helpful is the development of a housing extension officer that there's one within each region that can assist communities within those regions of doing that, because so often our local folks are wearing 5 hats already, as I describe it, and being a housing expert can sometimes be hard to do that. So providing that resource to our local communities, providing those support services that help them understand how to implement some of these different programs. At the local level, it's just about giving the time for the training and the development that our local folks need to do that, so that we're passing on that institutional knowledge that we have. Go ahead, Charlie. Building trades. Finally, this is our last one. And we'll be wrapping it up and taking our Q&A here. But at the state level, we need to expand our definition of workforce development and workforce development programs. So most states today, one of our key workforce developments is kind of on the technical side. How are we addressing our technical issues? But here we're saying we need to expand that to include our building trades as part of our workforce development. We need to assist our community colleges and high schools to expand these programs, to add the faculty that they need, but whatever it might be that they need to expand those programs, and also being able to give them the flexibility to add the programs that are appropriate for those regions. As I've always said, if Pittsburgh has a program, a plumbing program, I can tell you that Pittsburgh is probably trying to keep every one of those kids that are coming out of that program. And Chanute or an Iola is going to be struggling sometimes to get those kids to come into their community. So the more we can have these programs and encourage kids to enter them is going to benefit across the entire state. We need to think about creating some incentives for existing businesses to expand. Often on those business incentive programs, they're for our larger corporations, our larger manufacturers. How do we help maybe some of our local building trades businesses expand? So not only are we passing on knowledge to the next generation, but we're also maybe addressing one of those issues at the bottom there under local, which is succession planning. We heard a lot of our local trades folks are at or nearing retirement age. So how are we making sure that their business is maybe being passed on to the next generation? Tied closely to that then can be sponsorship programs. So for many years now, we've been thinking about sponsorship programs around rural health and sponsoring doctors and nurses. And I think we need to maybe be thinking about our building trades in the same way. Can we be sponsoring students going through programs to stay within our communities and to work there and provide the services that we need? So that kind of gives you a high level. We go into a lot more detail on each one of these strategies within the document. That gave you hopefully a high level overview. We just want to share a couple things before we answer some questions that we saw getting popped up. But we are assembling all the feedback. We got lots of great comments over the last 2 weeks, our comments from our committee, and we'll be finalizing that. And so look for the release of the plan in mid-December to early January. I always like to answer. So these are usually the first 2 questions that we'll be getting is when will the document be released and who will be implementing it? So I always want to emphasize no one group will implement this. and any of the final strategies. You know, there's things in here that KHRC will maybe take the point on. There's things in here that Office of Rural Prosperity and the Department of Commerce. There are items in here that are specifically more local based and will have to be locally done, locally initiated. So it really will take all partners from around the state, and it will take the support of both public and private sector to begin to, I like to frame it as, to be able to capitalize on all the great opportunities that we heard from folks around the state. So we're going to jump in here now and try and answer some of the questions that we saw coming up in the Q&A. So I don't know if Charlie or Emily would like to kind of note those. Go ahead.
Well, I'll just do a few right off the bat, more technical logistic ones that we had come through, and give Amy a chance to skim through some of them too while we go. Yes, all the slides will be made available on KHRC's website, including this one and including all the regional presentations we gave the past 2 weeks. Those will be posted on KHRC's website. A couple other questions in here. I think we were answering some of them live. So if any of you folks that we answered live, you'd like us to go into more detail, just let us know in the chat here. But we also had a question regarding housing, the last housing needs study, and if this report will include any housing needs data. And yes, it will include a housing demand forecast by region. So each of the 9 regions will be included in there. We have one question we wanted to answer live because it was maybe needed more than just a typed answer, and that was from Aaron. Many of these solutions appear geared towards tax incentives and breaks and credits for businesses and developers, which are tactics that seem pretty hit or miss historically in their implementation. Was there any consideration of giving more buying power to low income folks in these areas instead?
Sure. Do you want me to jump into that a little bit, Charlie, and then we can?
Sure. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
So if we're specifically thinking about things around down payment assistance, we did talk a little bit about that. And one of the things that we heard, we're kind of in a unique time right now in 2021, 2022, going into 2022. One is that there are a number of programs out there today, USDA, and a few others that are back to providing basically 0% finance or 0% down financing, those sorts of things. And we are at historically low interest rates. So what we were hearing so much was it wasn't necessarily the struggle to be able to come up with the down payment, as it was just actually having the unit to buy or to rent. That we really heard a lot more around kind of that production side. There just really wasn't the units there. So that's kind of generated probably us to look a little bit more on how do we increase production around the state because of the lack that we've had really the last almost 30 years. If you look in rural areas, since the 1970s, we've had such low production that we really needed to address that issue. And that really drives also our shortage of those moderate income units, whether it's rental or ownership, because they just literally weren't built for 20 or 30 years.
Yeah, we had, and Aaron, please let us know if that was kind of what you were looking at in the chat here. Actually, I'm going to stop my share here, I think.
Yes, thanks, Charlie.
There we go. Helen brought up a question that we actually heard in our listening sessions or our road tour this past 2 weeks regarding contractors, the cost of going into business, workman's comp, healthcare, all of that, making it near impossible to go on their own. So they leave rural areas and work for larger construction firms. We heard almost that exact same comment on our road tour going in, and definitely goes into that building human capital piece that Amy was talking about.
Yes, and so I was just reading the next question there too, Charlie, but I will. Yeah, so that's a great example of how, we talk about the things with the building trades, and that we do touch on some of those things. We just, within the study itself about how do we help that next generation getting into the business. The next question there, I think from Noah, on why aren't investments in cooperative housing included in the plan? We actually, in the draft plan itself, we do include kind of cooperative housing land trusts as a little bit of an example of how we could be doing some of affordable housing as one of the techniques. Again, that's a very local level thing that has to be done and produced too. But how do it is local, but yet it also takes programs like probably the moderate income housing program or LIHTC or those funding sources to fill the gap on those initial constructions. So yeah, we focused a little bit more on those funding techniques, but it is in there. I was actually just reviewing that this weekend.
Yeah, and that's similar to Amanda's question here. In fact, something we've used in our road tour presentations, and maybe didn't use it today, but she mentioned local incentives to pay for trade school scholarships. And the caveat being they work in the community for a certain number of years, perhaps after they graduate. And she mentions specifically hospitals and law firms. That's exactly the example we used in several of our presentations in the past, and yes, is one of the strategies we would be included in the list.
Charlie, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so sorry, I was just wanting to, for a moment, circle back to that question, a couple of questions back about kind of the concentration on the supply side rather than demand side, income side of.
Yes, thanks.
I thought I would just point out that we knew going into this that none of this is happening in a vacuum, and that, there are very much needs to address the need to keep incomes rising to meet housing costs. And I guess I wanted to point out that, that this specifically is a housing study, and that's why we really put the emphasis on what steps we at Kansas Housing and at Commerce could do to really concrete actions that could address some of these housing needs. But it doesn't mean that we didn't take into consideration the income side and the, as you noted in some of your earlier presentation, utilities, even some of those intangibles that we know affect the cost of the ability for housing affordability. So that's everything from preschool to education, and the fact that we know that none of this is in isolation and in a vacuum really it's integral not only on our office and on the whole team, but to make sure that we're working with all the different housing partners across the state, as well as just the nonprofit partners around the state, many of which are on this call, so that we're addressing some of these issues simultaneously. We'll take care of the housing, but we've got to be coming up with solutions on the healthcare and on the education, on preschool and everything else. So just thought that it was important that folks knew that we did take that into consideration, and that we're moving simultaneously to address with some of our partners out there across the state. Thanks.
So we've got a little thread going here regarding building trades, kind of circling back to, and this is maybe not a question that we might have to defer to someone else on. Does investment in trade education at community college require state level action? That actually came up a little bit in our last presentation in Chanute, actually last week. I don't know, Amy or others, if they have more detailed answers to that.
One of the things that we heard last week was the concern about, within a region, one community college could have the plumbing trade program, but within that same region, the next, they kind of partitioned it out and said, we're going to distribute those. And really that need of, so many of those schools having that. I don't think, my understanding, and somebody else on our team can correct us, my understanding is that's more of a policy piece than it is necessarily something that's codified, that those programs have to be distributed. So it's just a matter of looking at that policy of how and where we're allowing those programs to be expanded.
Mm-hmm.
Amy, I think we've talked about it's the Kansas Board of Regents that determines what that
Right.
policy is.
Yeah, and I think it's their kind of their policy historically. Yeah.
Just kind of scrolling through some questions, starting to filter in here. As I'm reading, sorry. Car-dependent cities make housing unaffordable, especially if you don't have a car, or at least a reliable one. Even living on the edge of town can lead to longer commute times and more traffic. Is there a plan to include more public transportation? I would say that's a pretty localized question. We do have some data points in here regarding not just housing costs, but also transportation costs in the study. But as far as including more public transportation broadly as a state level recommendation is not, is not something the study really targets at, but more of a localized level. If you're talking specifically in more metro areas like Johnson County and Sedgwick County, perhaps, but.
Yeah, sorry. I was to say, we do recommend or encourage that in our larger metropolitan areas that our moderate income and maybe even some of our low income housing tax credits should be located close to or adjacent to quality transit service. We also talk a little bit about density and the impact that density has on this very issue too, and really that density, the lack of density can have on the overall cost of housing too. So those are all things that are noted in the study too.
Paul brings up strategies, or I should say recommendations on target price range for different income levels and different housing prices on the market. That's very context sensitive, but yes, the study does provide kind of data points on, we showed on that chart on the previous slide, kind of what would be affordable to different income ranges and the gaps that exist in those by region. So yes, it will include that, and it will include a housing demand forecast. But stating a number of what would be affordable to, or excuse me, what price points would be affordable to different income levels as a broad statement, it was not really fair. We'd have to, what's affordable in one region of the state is going to be different than a different region of the state, just based on housing values and other costs and income levels. Is that fair, Amy? I don't know if
yes.
I'm
Yep. No, I think that's a good description. And I'll maybe take the next question here, Charlie, on kind of, I'll just kind of summarize it and say, how do we get everybody kind of within regions on the same page and moving in the same direction? So I think there's a twofold answer to this. One is there's been discussion and we're actually kind of recommending this a little bit in the study, is kind of keeping the committee together, putting together kind of a consortium that recognizes people from around the state that are experts in these areas or have passion around the housing topic, so they can continue to move some of these initiatives forward. I think the other piece of this that could be very helpful is the housing extension officer, who can be that region's kind of housing expert and can help communities. So they're hearing from one community in one county that they're thinking about, they're interested in doing something. Let's coordinate those efforts together. So helping facilitate some of that coordination, that could be part of the role that they're helping fill. And, when we've seen this in regions like the Northwest region, where they have not only their regional planning group, but some other, a regional housing initiative. And so there's some good examples of that kind of coordinated efforts that are happening out there in the state. So I think that gets us to Macy's question.
Yeah, what are going to be recommended, or what is going to be recommended to the state regarding accessible housing, universal design? That's a good question. I hate to sort of indirectly answer it, but a lot of the strategies do actually address accessible housing and universal design, in the sense of Those can be kind of criteria in administering the programs or administering the different strategies. And if this is identified as a need in a certain area, then maybe you get more points if you're doing accessible or universal design. As Amy, I think, mentioned in one of her slides when talking about some of the implementation of the strategies, as far as things like code requirements or things like that, that's at the state level. We kind of heard a lot of the desire for having local policies and zoning and codes ability rather than kind of a state level code regarding accessible or universal design. And so that kind of filters into some of the zoning changes that Amy talked about as well, or code changes on a local level. I don't know, Amy, if you had anything to add.
No, I think that's probably a pretty good summary.
I think, Paul, we'll have to get in contact with you later. That's not really something we, let's see, we can really answer today on our answer on this webinar, so we can follow up afterwards.
Okay. I noticed there's in the chat, there's a question of whether or not the state will consider incentivizing the development of maintenance-free housing for Kansans 55 and older. And that goes to, I think that really fits in with our diverse housing products. So how are we encouraging or incentivizing more diverse housing products than what we've seen in the past, and giving preferences in different programs and so forth to products that kind of address that need and address that gap. We didn't necessarily call out a specific, we need to develop a program that's specifically targeted to that, but just injecting funding into the programs that we have today that can help facilitate some of that within that kind of, we don't need to reinvent the wheel, I guess. I think that was probably one of our last questions, correct, Charlie?
Not seeing any more filter in. I know we had the webinar go till, or at least advertised till 1:30, just in case folks, we did have a lot of questions. So we can continue to stick around a little bit more if folks are letting stuff simmer in their head and still have things to answer. But to reiterate kind of Amy's last slide, our last slide here, we are assembling all of our feedback we heard over the last 2 weeks, including today as well. And we do plan, the plan will be released and posted on the KHRC's website mid-December, early January, as we kind of incorporate some of these things we heard into the study. Any other logistics I'm missing before? I think that was pretty.
Yeah, there was one more in the chat here, Charlie, and I'll just maybe hit on it real quick on the HUD programs being, as an investor, being kind of difficult to use or to get into. So I'll say two things there. One, again, that's something that potentially our kind of housing resource officer could assist with. The other piece that we talked about was, so it was shared with us that a number of years ago, there used to be kind of this series of events that HUD, I think, a lot of times would put on, of kind of just knowledge sharing sorts of things. And we've really encouraged that something like that needs to be reinstituted, of people kind of sharing programs, sharing knowledge, and, regular events like that. So that's kind of a twofold answer to your question, but we definitely heard those things aren't easy. Finding inspectors for those programs, all of those things we kind of touch on in a little bit more detail. Okay.
Well, we'll continue to stick around for a few more minutes. For those that need to get going, thank you for joining us. Wish you a happy holidays. I saw many familiar names on here, and glad to see so many people join. And we look forward to continuing to work on the housing issues in Kansas and release the study here shortly.
Thank you, everyone.